I took the night security job because it paid well, asked few questions, and came with the kind of silence you only get far from towns and roads. The kind of work where nothing happens, and that's the point. Where you sit in a control room with stale coffee and flickering monitors and count hours instead of problems. And when the contractor emailed me the location, I remember frowning at my screen because the address didn't pull up on any map app I tried. Not satellite, not street view, not even the old offline maps I kept on my phone. Just a blank stretch of forest and a service road with no name. But the instructions were clear enough that I figured it was one of those facilities that like to stay off the books. Research parks, data centers, places that existed more as ideas than buildings. And I needed the money badly enough that I didn't push it. The gate was already open when I arrived just before midnight. A tall fence swallowed by fog. The keypad dark, but the arm lifted like it recognized me. And beyond it the road curved inward, swallowed by trees, my headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through mist until the facility emerged ahead of me, low and wide and ugly, all concrete and metal, no sign, no logo, just a block of structure squatting in the dark like it had grown there. Inside, the control room was smaller than I expected. A desk bolted to the floor, 6 monitors mounted on the wall showing different angles of the same place. Long corridors, loading bays, stairwells, all identical in that institutional way that makes it hard to tell where you are, even when you're looking straight at it. And on the desk, neatly stacked, was a folder with my name printed on the front in plain black text. Inside the folder was a single sheet of paper titled Rules for Night Security, and before I even read them, I felt that little warning prickle at the base of my skull, the one that usually comes when something is wrong, but not wrong enough yet to justify leaving. The rules were short, typed, numbered, written in calm, professional language, like a safety manual, and they read: 1. Do not respond to voices on channel 3. 2. If a hallway repeats on camera, turn off the monitor immediately. 3. At 0217, all interior doors must be unlocked. 4. If a maintenance worker asks for help, say, "You already finished." 5. Do not conduct exterior patrols after 3 a.m. Beneath the list was a final line in smaller font. If a rule is broken, follow correction instructions exactly. I stood there for a while with the paper in my hand, listening to the hum of the lights, telling myself that every weird job had a quirk, that voices probably meant interference, that repeating hallways were camera glitches, that the maintenance line was some internal joke, and that the door unlock thing was probably for automated systems that ran overnight. But it was that last line that stuck with me. The casual assumption that rules would be broken, not punished immediately, just corrected. Like errors in a process, the first hour passed quietly, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. The monitors showing empty corridors, the occasional flicker of static rolling through like distant rain, and when Channel 3 lit up on the radio panel for the first time, I felt a spike of alertness, but it was just a burst of white noise, sharp and brief, and then it went dead again. And I laughed under my breath and made a note in the log like a good employee. It wasn't until after one that I noticed the first thing that didn't fit. One of the corridor feeds, showing the same stretch of hallway, twice in a row, the same fire extinguisher on the left wall, the same scuff mark on the floor, the same exit sign flickering, looping back on itself in a way that made my eyes slide off it. And I stared for a second too long, trying to figure out if the camera had frozen or if my brain was just tired. And then I remembered Rule 2 and felt a small jolt of adrenaline. But instead of shutting the monitor off immediately like it said, I hesitated, my finger hovering over the switch while I leaned closer, squinting. And in that hesitation, the image snapped back to normal, the hallway extending forward the way it should. And nothing happened. No alarm, no scream, no punishment. Just a return to boring normality. And I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, convinced I'd just imagined it. About 30 seconds later, a soft chime sounded from the desk, and a new sheet of paper slid out of the small printer mounted beneath the monitors. The paper warm when I picked it up, and printed on it was a single sentence. Correction required. Reset camera feed at 2 before 2 a.m. My heart thudded harder than it should have, because that meant two things at once. That I had in fact broken a rule, and that the facility knew it, but also that nothing terrible had happened yet, just a task, a fix, like the system was forgiving, as long as I complied. The reset was simple, a button press on the control panel, the feed blinking out and back in, and when I did it, the printer stayed silent. No further instructions, and the sense of unease ebbed just enough for me to keep going. That was when I started to believe the rules were more like guidelines, that mistakes were expected, that as long as you corrected them, you were fine. And that belief is what made the second mistake possible. It happened just before 2, when Channel 3 crackled again, louder this time, and instead of pure static, there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that made my brain want to lean into it, and then, under the noise, something that almost sounded like a voice saying my name. Not clearly, not fully formed, but close enough that I reacted without thinking. My thumb hitting the talk button, as I said, "Control here." And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt cold wash through me, because Rule 1 wasn't ambiguous at all, and I'd just broken it cleanly. Channel 3 went silent, the other feeds flickering once like a collective blink, and for a long, awful second, nothing happened. And then, the printer word again, louder this time, more urgent, and the paper it spat out had 2 lines instead of 1. Correction required, isolate channel, 3 immediately, correction required, complete before 2:17. I checked the clock and felt my stomach tighten, because 2:17 was the time listed in Rule 3, the time when all doors had to be unlocked, and now I had 2 tasks with overlapping windows, one explicit and one implied, and suddenly the rules didn't feel like friendly guidelines anymore. They felt like a schedule, a tight one. Isolating Channel 3 meant physically going to the communications room down the hall, pulling a breaker, something I hadn't planned to do that night. But I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the control room. The corridor colder than before, the hum of the building deeper, almost like breathing. And as I walked, I became aware of another sound layered under my footsteps, a faint, distant clatter like tools being set down. And I remembered Rule 4 and felt my pulse quicken. The communications room was where it was supposed to be, a metal door with a faded label, and inside the breaker box was clearly marked. And when I pulled it, the lights flickered, and the radio panel on my belt went dead. Channel 3 gone, and I felt a brief, foolish surge of pride at having fixed it in time. I was halfway back to the control room when a figure stepped out from a side corridor ahead of me. Tall, wearing a maintenance uniform that looked too clean at first glance. Reflective stripes dull in my flashlight beam. and he raised a hand in a casual wave and said, "Hey, can you give me a hand with something?" And my mind raced. Rule 4 flashing bright and clear, and I opened my mouth to say the phrase exactly as written. But before I could, he smiled, and something about the smile made me pause, just for a fraction of a second, because it wasn't threatening or strange. It was tired, familiar, like someone at the end of a long shift, and that pause was enough for him to tilt his head and add, "Never mind. I think I already finished." And then he stepped back into the corridor and was gone, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and the bitter realization that I hadn't said the line at all, that I'd broken another rule by omission this time, not by action. And I didn't even know what the correction would be. The printer answered that question a minute later when I got back to the control room, the paper sliding out in a hurry, the text bolded in places, "Correction required, confirm maintenance completion, locate maintenance worker, and issue phrase, complete before 2:30. 3 corrections now, stacked like weights, and the clock ticking steadily towards 2:17. The doors task looming like a wall I still had to hit. I started unlocking the doors early, moving down the list on the panel, watching each indicator flip from red to green, my fingers moving faster as the seconds slipped away. And that's when I noticed one of the corridor feeds starting to loop again. Not fully, just a subtle stutter, the same section repeating with a slight delay. And I swore under my breath because I didn't have time to deal with another correction. And I turned the monitor off without thinking, the screen going black, and the printer stayed silent. Mercifully, but the sense of pressure didn't ease. It built, a tightness in my chest that made every breath shallow. At 2:16, with one door left, the panel froze, the indicator refusing to change, and on, the black monitor I'd just shut off. A faint reflection appeared, my own face ghosted in the dark glass, and behind it, just barely, the outline of the maintenance worker standing too close, his mouth opening as if to speak, and the printer screamed to life, the paper tearing slightly as it fed through. The message short and brutal. Correction failed. Manual intervention required. I ran. I don't remember deciding to. My body just moved. Out of the control room. Down the corridor toward the stuck door. The building's hum rising in pitch. Lights flickering in waves ahead of me. And as I reached the door, the clock hit 2:17. And every unlocked indicator flashed green at once. The sound like a breath being released, except the door in front of me stayed stubbornly red. Behind me, footsteps echoed, slow and unhurried, and I knew without looking who it was, and that I was out of time, that I couldn't complete all the tasks, that the system was designed to overload you eventually, to stack small forgivable mistakes until there was no clean solution left. That realization hit with a strange clarity, and instead of panicking, I stopped, my hand on the door, and thought about the rules not as commandments, but as assumptions, about how every correction so far had been about restoring order, about keeping things running, and how none of them had considered the possibility of someone simply leaving. Rule 5 said not to patrol outside after 3 a.m., not that you couldn't go outside at all. And Rule 3 demanded doors be unlocked, but it didn't say you had to stay inside once they were. And the more I thought about it, the more obvious it became that the system tracked compliance, not escape. The footsteps behind me paused. close enough that I could hear fabric shift, and the maintenance worker's voice came again. Calm, almost kind, "You're behind schedule." And instead of turning around, instead of fixing the door, I made my choice, deliberate and clear, and broke one last rule on purpose by pulling the fire exit lever beside me, the alarm shrieking as the door burst open and cold night air rushed in. The sudden contrast, like diving into water. The lights inside flared, every monitor in the control room blowing out to white for a split second before going dark, the printer spitting out one final sheet that fluttered uselessly to the floor, unread, and I ran into the fog, not looking back. The sound of the alarm cutting off abruptly behind me as the building seemed to shudder and settle, like something winding down. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and when I looked back, the facility was dark and silent. No hum, no flicker, just a slab of concrete under the stars, and for the first time since I'd arrived, it felt empty. I reported the incident the next day, vague and careful. Electrical faults, malfunctioning equipment, nothing about voices or rules. And when I went to pull up the address to file the paperwork, it still didn't exist. Just a blank patch of forest, and the contractor never returned my calls. Weeks later, the folder showed up in my mailbox, the same one from the control room, empty except for a new sheet of paper that read, "Status, unresolved. Chapter closed." I didn't take another night job after that, but sometimes, just before sleep, I think about how easy it was to make the first mistake, how forgiving the system felt at the start, and how close I came to believing that fixing things was the same as being safe. And I wonder how many people are still in places like that, correcting small errors, following rules that were never meant to be finished, unaware that the only real solution was to stop playing along and leave while they still could.